Hello, everyone. Today we have with us Dr. Andrew Michta. Dr. Andrew Michta has served as the Dean of the College of International and Security Studies at the George C. Marshall European Center for Security Studies since 2016. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Scowcraft Center for Strategy and Security. Previously, Dr. Michta was a professor of national security affairs at the U.S. Naval War College, an adjunct fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies Europe program, and an affiliate of the Minda D. Ginsburg Center for European Studies at Harvard University. Dr. Michta is also a prolific writer. His most recent book, The Future of NATO, Regional Defense and Global Security, was published by the University of Michigan Press in 2014. He is a contributing editor for 1945, a nonpartisan journal devoted to foreign and security policy issues. Dr. Michta, I welcome you and thank you for taking time out to be with us today.
Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure.
Thank you. So we'll get right to the questions. So we're here to talk about the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict, which has been going on for more than about a year now, and we're trying to just give our viewers an understanding as to how this will, how it's going to play out, and also, sort of as we keep taking you through the questions, we want to understand how India also factors in. So, Dr. Michta, if you could just, elaborate on the multifaceted impact of the ongoing Ukraine conflict and how it's affected Russia's domestic economy and its standing in the international community.
Yeah, as I've written elsewhere, I consider this war to be a system-transforming conflict in the sense that it kind of ended the period of the 3 decades of post-Cold War, relative peace, globalization, the kind of peace dividend that allowed governments to reduce their defense spending. We have now the largest war, conventional war, in Europe since 1945. And the assumptions that we've had about the rules-based international order and the ability to diffuse the conflicts have been put into question. Second point is we are now essentially facing two powers, Russia and China, that are aligned in their opposition to the United States and to democracies more broadly. They're different. Russia is more of a revisionist state. Putin is relitigating 1991. This is really, it could be called the last battle of the end of the Cold War, maybe the second to the last. China is much more existential in terms of the challenge it poses to the US and the West. It wants to not so much revise the system, but replace the international system around its ideology, around its interests, its concept of mercantile capitalism, and make China really the dominant power. So we're looking at an inflection point in global history, and we're learning in the process that a lot of our assumptions about what kind of militaries we need to have and how dependent we've become on our adversaries, those questions have to be revisited. Russia itself, for Russia, this is almost like a turning inward point. Putin was trying to essentially restore the former empire. The Russians look at Ukraine and Belarus as parts of the larger Slavic space that they've controlled historically, whether it was under the Tsars or under the Soviet Union. And for Putin, control over Ukraine is an existential question. Without it, Russia cannot be an empire. What has happened over the last year and a half has really imposed a lot of pressure on the Russian economy, but they're navigating the sanctions still relatively well. They will take effect. Really, you will see the impact over time. China is helping Russia by buying its energy. The Chinese increased the import of black coal from Russia by 20%, more than doubled their import of pipeline gas from Russia and LNG, and they're also building a new pipeline to connect the two countries. So China is kind of bailing the Russians out, but that also makes Russia much more dependent on China. So you could talk about a process of vassalization of Russia towards China. In effect, the entire geopolitics of Eurasia is changing as a result of this. And we probably will not see the end game here until we see some serious impact domestically We've seen some instances of that, like with the attempted mutiny by the Wagner people and also the kind of outflow of Russian citizens initially. So we don't know yet what the long-term impact on Russia will be, but clearly it will destabilize the country domestically.
Thank you, Dr. Michta. And now that you've brought up Wagner and the recent, sort of uprising that lasted one day, but I mean, is that one of many that are yet to come, or is that maybe just a one-off thing? And how has that impacted Russia's global standing in the global the international community?
Well, I think what the mutiny indicated, and I don't think it was staged. Initially, people were saying that this could have been a false flag operation. But the way Putin responded to this, remember his statements, he was clearly shaken and called Wagner traitors and vowed that they will be severely punished, and then cut a deal allowing the Wagner people to basically exfil into Belarus. This creates a precedent because, quite frankly, all of a sudden everybody sees that you can stand up to the czar, quote unquote, and at least for now, get away scot-free and nothing happens to you. I think this was more of a signal to Putin from his entourage that things are not going well. Russia is a very corrupt state. People who are close to Putin are making an inordinate amount of money. The country is overall still quite poor, but the people who are in this center of power have done very well. Excuse me. So I suspect that what it was actually was Putin having lost some of his influence and standing, and people around him signaling to him, especially if you look at how the military did not respond. They were very reluctant to get engaged. They could have easily stopped Wagner, and he managed to get to Rostov, and then there was no military response in Rostov. His people shot down a couple of helicopters, killed a number of Russian soldiers, and yet there seems to be no retribution for that. The key question is, can Putin, in effect, restore control over his security services and his military? If he does, then I think he can use the Wagner incident to actually complete the process of mobilizing the Russian society, arguing that the enemy is within, it's not just in Ukraine, and complete the transition to the kind of quasi-totalitarian dictatorship that Russia has been tracking in the direction of for quite some time. One more general comment, in terms of Russian history, we have ample examples that when the Russian military performed poorly in foreign wars, this caused a resentment at home and caused centrifugal pressures to start fracturing the political structures. That happened with the Crimean War in the 19th century. It happened in 1904-05 when Russia lost the war to the Japanese. The Battle of Tsushima kind of humiliated the Russian Navy. It happened in the First World War when the Germans were beating the Russian forces. From 1914 on, it ended in a mutiny in the Russian army and then two revolutions, a bloody civil war. And more recently, the Russians left Afghanistan in 1989, and 2 years later, the state ceased to exist. So I would pay close attention to how the developments in Ukraine, the relative inability of the Russians to succeed, will then translate at the situation at home, especially if the economic conditions worsen.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Michta. And since, when the first question, you also talked a bit about, China importing Russian energy, coal and, sort of LNG and all sorts of energy. So taking the, because India also has purchased quite a bit of Russian oil and all those things. So what does that mean, for going forward for the global energy mix, and what does that signify?
Well, globalization was made possible in large part for two reasons. One was that with the end of the Warsaw Pact and the kind of connecting Russia full bore to the global economic structure, Russia dumped a lot of cheap energy into the system. That's the first part. The second part was the Chinese labor pool, the movement of supply chains to China and to Asia more broadly was largely driven by labor arbitrage. The costs of labor in China were orders of magnitude lower. That both allowed us to consume at higher level, at lower cost, because of cheap energy on the one hand and cheap labor. It modernized and industrialized China in a way that has made China now a real existential threat to the West. We call it a pacing threat in our national security documents. Russia is a relatively simple problem set. It's largely a military problem. It's a small economy. It's not really a leader in any area other than energy and then, the military, defense manufacturing, and the nuclear power. China is a very complex threat because it's so embedded in our structures. I think the question for India is where it wants to position itself in this great power competition between democracies, really, and the kind of China-Russia de facto alliance. I think India is positioned to play a much greater role internationally going forward, in large part because I believe it's already, in terms of population, it's exceeded China. The Chinese are looking at a very poor population projection picture going forward. India has a highly educated and skilled population, and I think especially being connected closer to the West, it can accelerate the process of modernization in the areas of cutting edge technology. So this war, the kind of relative eclipse of Russia in the process, I mean, our assessment of how good the Russian military, for example, has declined significantly. India used to buy a lot of Russian equipment when it came to weapon systems. Well, I would submit to you that your government probably is scratching its head right now, thinking, should we be doing it, considering how inferior those weapon systems were relative to the Western systems. So I think that for India, it will be a question of how close it wants to get to the West, both in economic and political terms. And then what are the risks for India when it comes to its relationship with China? I was recently in Washington, and I remember talking to one of your senior military officers, and he underscored how important to India it was not to be sucked into this competition, but to be able to preserve the autonomy, to be able to act independently. I think this crisis creates an opportunity for India to accelerate your modernization, but also creates risks, especially in its relationship with China.
Thank you, Dr. Michta. I also wanted to ask you about the China, Russia dynamics and how that will impact India. But thank you, you brought that up pretty well. So I think we can move on. And I mean, given India's closeness to the recent closeness to the US now with the PM's visit, so all sorts of MOUs being signed, defense partnerships, HAL, GE Aerospace, and all those sorts of things. So how possibly does Russia perceive that, and what does that mean for India, US, and India, Russia, bilateral ties going forward?
I think it's very important, both for the United States and for India, that we increase the level of cooperation between the two countries. There is a kind of unfortunate term that political scientists use when they speak about the global South. I don't think there is such a thing as a global South. I think those countries are very diverse. They've got different regional balances, different interests. So this kind of blanket statement doesn't really do it justice. But India stands out by virtue of its size, the fact that it has tremendous growth potential. And in terms of the values that you represent, you're very closely aligned in terms of just your traditions to the values of Western democracies. You're not with the totalitarians. You're not on the other side. There are other issues that play into it. The Pakistan-India issue, the tensions that are there, they're going to remain in place, I think. With the United States out of Afghanistan and the global war on terror having ended, our relationship with Pakistan, I think, is going to change. It's not going to be prioritized as it was during the global war on terror to the same extent. I think the Russians, and this is what worries me the most, the Russians are pretty much de-Westernizing right now. If you read what Putin has been saying and the various media statements, I watch a lot of Russian television by virtue of what I do. It's a clear rejection of this kind of Westernizing influences that Russia lived under. And they talk about Russia becoming a Eurasian civilization, that they're distinct, that this is a civilizational war. According to Putin, he is not fighting against Ukraine, he's fighting against the West. So he would see the victory in the war in Ukraine, should it come to that, as a civilizational win. which means that Russia is becoming more and more disconnected from the international system and more dependent on China. The Chinese are not only supporting Russia in terms of energy, but also in terms of some components. They're not sending, ready-made weapon systems, but even things like getting munitions from North Korea. North Korea probably would not be doing that for the Russians had the Chinese not approved this, or at least looked the other way. So we're looking at a closer cooperation with the Chinese, between Russians and the Chinese. I also wonder to what extent China thinks that it's increasingly tying itself to a corpse, so to speak, because the Russian military performed truly subpar. We underestimated the Ukrainians and we overestimated the Russians. Having said that, I always warn my colleagues not to dismiss the Russians' ability to rebuild. If you look at this particular offensive in Ukraine, it's going slow, in large part because the Russians have built extensive defenses and because they've shown they can both fight and mobilize at the same time. So I always tell my friends the Russians are never as strong as they claim to be, but never as weak as some people believe them to be. But they're clearly becoming a junior partner to China. One more very important element here. The Chinese are building their Navy. Numerically, they've got a larger Navy now than the US Navy is, but in terms of quality, they don't come nearly close to what we represent. And the point is that the Russians have developed weapon systems much more sophisticated, especially when it comes to submarines and hypersonics, than anything the Chinese have been able to field. And my concern is that the Chinese will try to target that more advanced Russian technology, which the Russians managed to develop when they had access to Western systems. They build on the post-Soviet designs, like the propulsion systems for their submarines, for example, is much quieter today than it used to be. The Chinese can't build that. They mass manufacture a lot of things, but designing and building state-of-the-art weapon systems is not necessarily something that comes with that. So my concern is that as this relationship becomes more closely intertwined, that the Chinese will gain access to that technology, and that will make them a much more dangerous adversary for the West.
No, thank you, Dr. Michta. I think that's about it. I mean, what we wanted to know, and the way you wonderfully, sort of summed it all up for our viewers. I think it'll be very easy for them to, sort of understand what's happening and what's to come. So thank you, Dr. Michta, for your time. It was a pleasure speaking to you.
Thank you very much, sir. I appreciate you having me.